In the shadowed folds of the Ozark National Forest, a routine search and rescue mission becomes a descent into primal terror. Grant McAllister and his team uncover evidence of a creature, ancient, cunning, relentless, that defies explanation, claiming one of their own and leaving the rest scarred by its gaze. From a cryptic phone call to a haunting photograph, this is a tale of survival against the incomprehensible, brought to you by the Forbidden Excavation. What secrets hide in the wilds you've never dared to tread? Will you listen and still believe the forest is safe? The call that changed everything. A summons to the abyss. The phone rang as the sun bled into the horizon, a shrill trill slicing through the ranger station's stale air. I was elbow-deep in routine, coiling ropes into tight loops, their hemp scent mingling with the tang of gasoline from the ATV I just refueled. The station, a squat brick building perched on the edge of Arkansas's Ozark National Forest, was my refuge after a day of heat and dust. My hands, roughened by 8 years with search and rescue, moved on autopilot, but my mind was elsewhere, drifting to the quiet life I'd left behind a decade ago as a structural engineer. Back then, I traded blueprints for boots, fleeing the slow choke of fluorescent lights and deadlines for the promise of sky and soil. That choice felt like freedom until the evening of March 31st, 2019, when Hargrove shuffled over, his boots scuffing the linoleum. Hargrove was a relic, 50-something, grizzled, with a voice like gravel tumbling down a dry creek bed. He dropped a manila envelope onto the desk, its edges worn, stamped urgent, in red ink that looked wet in the dim light. "Got a job," he said, folding his arms. "2 hikers missing. You're up." I tore it open, the paper crackling like dead leaves, and scanned the contents. Jessica Pruitt, 24, and Miles Everett, 27. Last seen 3 days ago near Whitaker Point, a rugged outcrop in the Ozark wilds. The briefing was sparse, a skeleton of facts. Avid hikers, experienced, not the sort to vanish over a sprained ankle or a missed turn. Their last known coordinates pinned them to an unofficial trail, a phantom path absent from park maps but etched into the murmurs of locals who knew better than to tread it. I leaned back in the creaking chair, the envelope's weight settling in my hands. Jessica's family painted her as meticulous, short, freckled, with a habit of sketching trails in notebooks, her routes planned down to the mile. Miles was taller, lean, a former college track runner who'd traded pavement for peaks, always chasing the next thrill. They'd set out on a Friday, promising a check-in by Sunday. When Monday dawned silent, their phones dead and their car unmoved, dread took root. 3 days is too long, I said, more to myself than Hargrove. He nodded, his gray eyes unreadable. Take Eddie and Sherry. Gear up. You roll out at first light. Eddie Claremont was in the garage when I found him, hunched over a radio with a screwdriver, his wiry frame swallowed by a faded flannel shirt. His sandy hair stuck out in tufts, and he grinned when he saw me, teeth flashing like a beacon. Another lost soul gig, huh? Bet they're holed up in a cave, living off berries and bad decisions. His laugh was a chainsaw's rasp, loud and jagged, cutting through the tension. Eddie was 4 years into rescue work, a former mechanic from Little Rock who'd lost his shop to a flood in 15. He'd rebuilt himself out here, trading oil-stained overalls for a harness and a knack for finding people in the dark. I liked him. His humor was a lifeline when the woods turned mean. Sherry Hang arrived minutes later, her boots clicking with military precision. Late 30s, ex-army. She carried herself like a blade straight-backed, eyes sharp beneath a tight bun of dark hair. She'd seen combat in Iraq, a fact she never flaunted but wore in the steady way she handled gear, the faint scar tracing her left jaw. "Brief me," she said, slinging a med kit over her shoulder. I handed her the envelope, watching her scan it with a soldier's focus. 2 missing, 3 days cold. Unofficial trail near Whitaker. Last seen Friday. She nodded, lips a thin line. Sounds like trouble. By dawn, we were ready. The ATVs growled to life, loaded with ropes, radios, first aid kits, and enough water to last a day. The station faded in the rearview as we roared toward the trailhead, the sky a pale bruise above the forest's dark bulk. The Ozarks loomed ahead, hills jagged with limestone, hollows choked with oak and pine, a sprawl of green that swallowed light and sound. I'd seen it claim people before. A hiker too stubborn to pack a map, a hunter too drunk to mark his path. But Jessica and Miles weren't those people. Something else had gone wrong. Something the briefing didn't dare name. Into the green abyss, the trail's first whispers. The gravel lot was a desolate speck when we arrived, Jessica and Miles's car. A faded blue sedan, parked at its edge like a forgotten relic. Dust coated its hood, a thin shroud undisturbed by wind or rain, and the windows were up, doors locked tight. I pried the driver's side open with a slim Jim, the metal scraping like a sigh, and found a receipt crumpled on the passenger seat. A diner 10 miles south. Eggs, coffee, toast, time-stamped 11:47 a.m., 3 days ago. Their last meal before the hike. A mundane anchor to a world they'd left behind. I bagged it, the plastic crinkling in my grip, and handed it to Sherry. "Last stop," I said. She nodded, tucking it into her pack. The trail began as a narrow slash of dirt, winding past oaks with gnarled limbs and pines that stabbed the sky, their needles carpeting the ground in rust. The air was thick with the scent of sap and earth, the sun filtering through a canopy that turned daylight into dusk. 20 minutes in, the first clue jolted us from the rhythm of our steps. A water bottle, plastic and battered, wedged between two rocks like a discarded toy. Scratches marred its surface, deep and uneven, and the cap bore a dark smear, tacky to the touch. Blood? Mud? Sap? I couldn't tell, not out here, but the sight twisted something in my chest. Sherry crouched, gloved hands steady as she bagged it. "Could be nothing," she said, but her eyes lingered on the smear, unconvinced. 5 minutes deeper, we stumbled into a clearing, or what should have been one. A fire pit sat at its heart, ashes cold and gray, ringed by stones blackened from flame. No tent stakes pierced the soil, no packs leaned against trees. Just an empty space where a camp should have buzzed with life. The absence was louder than any sound, a void that gnawed at the edges of reason. Then the smell hit, faint at first, a whiff of rot that sharpened as we stood there, acrid and sour, like meat left too long in the sun. Eddie's nose wrinkled, his grin faltering. "Something's dead out here," he said, forcing levity. "Time to play find the carcass?" The words hung limp, and we followed the stench, pushing through a snarl of thorny underbrush that snagged at our pants, drawing pinpricks of blood from my shins. Flies were our guides, their buzzing a droning hymn that led us to the source. A deer, or half of one, sprawled in a patch of ferns like a sacrifice. Its head was intact, antlers tangled in the greenery, eyes clouded to a milky white that stared past us into nothing. But its torso was a hollowed-out ruin, ribs splayed like broken fingers, the cavity emptied of flesh and organs. No meat remained, just a shell of skin and bone, shredded with a violence that defied logic. Sherry knelt, her flashlight tracing the edges, her breath steady despite the sight. "This wasn't eaten," she said, voice low and measured. "No bite marks, no scavenger tears, just shredded. Something tore it apart and walked away." Eddie retched behind a tree, his bravado crumbling, and I couldn't blame him. I'd seen bear kills, cougar takedowns, messy, purposeful, driven by hunger. This was different, wasteful, cruel. The forest grew quieter as we pressed on, the silence a weight that pressed against my skull. Birds should have trilled from the branches. Squirrels chattered through the undergrowth, but nothing stirred. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and my flashlight flickered, its beam faltering in the growing gloom. By sundown, a scrap of blue fabric snagged on a low branch stopped us cold, bright, synthetic, frayed at the edges, matching Jessica's jacket from the report. The trail turned frantic from there. Grass flattened in desperate patches, twigs snapped like brittle bones. Another shred of cloth caught on a jagged rock like a flag marking a fall. It led us to a ravine, its cliffs rising sharp and gray on one side, a sheer drop into shadow on the other, a chasm that seemed to breathe. Barefoot prints marked the dirt, human in shape but wrong. The toes stretched too long, unnaturally elongated, the gait erratic, crisscrossing like a stumble or a crawl. Deep imprints suggested weight, purpose, but the chaos of their pattern hinted at something unhinged. "This is all kinds of messed up," Eddie muttered, his rifle shifting in his grip, knuckles white. Sherry snapped, "Quit complaining." But her voice wavered, her eyes darting to the shadows. I knelt, tracing a print with my finger, the soil cool and damp. Not Jessica's, not Miles's. Something else had walked here, something that didn't belong. Eddie's shout came moments later, sharp and urgent, from 20 yards ahead. He'd found a backpack, wedged into a rock crevice, its straps torn as if ripped free. Inside, a granola bar, half-eaten. A flashlight, its lens cracked. A phone, screen shattered but flickering to life when I pressed the power button. The battery clung to a sliver of charge, and the last photo loaded. A blurry nightmare of a gaping, tooth-filled maw, wide with rage or hunger, pale orbs glowing behind it like twin moons in a void. My stomach twisted into a knot, bile rising in my throat. Whatever they'd seen, it had been close enough to smell, to hear. "We're near it," Sherry said, her voice steel, her hand resting on her sidearm. Eddie and I argued for backup, for caution, our voices overlapping in the still air. She overruled us, eyes hard. "No time. We move now." The ravine of no return, death's quiet stage. The ravine narrowed as we descended, its walls closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of moss and stone, and our breaths fogged in the dim light of our flashlights. At its end stood a sheer rock face, slick with seepage, its surface pocked with lichen and time. And there, propped against it like a broken doll, was Miles, or what remained of him. His torso lay intact, shirt torn open to reveal a chest pale and still, but his arms and legs were gone, ripped off at the joints with a force that left the stumps jagged and bloodless. The wounds weren't clean. Bone protruded in splintered shards, flesh shredded like wet paper, but no blood pooled beneath him, as if it had been drained or taken. His face was a mask of terror, eyes wide and unseeing, mouth stretched in a silent scream, throat slashed open in a crimson arc that glistened wetly in the beam. Sherry knelt, her flashlight sweeping the scene with clinical precision, her gloved hand hovering over the corpse. "No struggle," she said, voice flat despite the horror.
"No defensive wounds, no scuff marks."
Caught off guard. Didn't even have time to fight. Eddie's breath hitched, a ragged sound that echoed off the cliffs, and he turned away, shoulders trembling. I couldn't look at him. My mind raced to Jessica, to the slim chance she still drew breath. If this thing had spared her, if it had moved on, we might find her. I marked the spot with a GPS pin, stabbing the device into the dirt like a stake, and tried the radio. The signal was weak, static swallowing my words. One victim, male, deceased, ravine. Into a garbled mess. Backup wouldn't come soon, if at all. We pressed on, the forest tightening its grip. The trees grew thicker, their bark gnarled and black, branches interlocking like skeletal fingers overhead. The air chilled further, my jacket no match for the damp that seeped into my bones. My flashlight flickered, its beams stuttering, casting shadows that twisted and stretched. Long, sinewy shapes that didn't match the trunks or rocks around us. A snap echoed, heavy and close, like a branch breaking under weight, and Eddie spun, rifle raised, eyes wild. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. Sherry shushed him, her own hand hovering near her sidearm, but the silence returned, thick and oppressive. I strained for the sound again, ears ringing with the absence, my pulse hammering in my throat. It didn't repeat. An hour later, we found her. Jessica, huddled against a tree, her clothes shredded into ribbons of blue and gray, arms and face crisscrossed with scratches, shallow and frantic, as if she'd clawed at herself or something had clawed at her. Her hair, once auburn and neat, hung in tangled clumps, matted with dirt and blood. Her eyes darted, wild and glassy, unable to settle on us or the world beyond, pupils blown wide with terror. I crouched, keeping my distance, voice soft as if coaxing a wounded deer.
Jessica, I'm Grant.
We're here to help. You're safe now. She didn't speak, didn't nod, her breath shallow and ragged. Then, slow and deliberate, she raised a trembling hand and pointed behind me. Her finger a quivering arrow aimed at the dark. I turned, the motion instinctive, and froze. It stood there, half shrouded by the trees, a creature taller than any man I'd known. Its frame gaunt yet taut with muscle, a nightmare distilled from shadow and bone. Its skin was gray, patchy, stretched tight over a skeleton that jutted like blades beneath, a parody of starvation and strength. Claws glistened at the ends of its hands, long and curved, wet with something dark, blood, sap, or worse. Sparse strands of wiry black hair clung to its form, patchy and coarse, doing nothing to mask the grotesque contours of its body. Shoulders too broad, spine too arched, legs bent in a way that suggested speed and power. Its mouth was a chaos of jagged teeth, each one grown without care for order or symmetry, a maw built to rend flesh and grind bone. It didn't move, didn't growl, but its presence was a weight, a suffocating malice that pressed against my chest. Its eyes, pale, unblinking, glowing faintly in the gloom, locked onto mine, and the world tilted, my knees buckling under the gaze. Eddie fired without a word, the rifle's crack splitting the night like thunder. The bullet slammed into its chest, a dark bloom spreading across the gray skin, and it staggered, a low grunt rasping from its throat, more annoyance than pain. Then it darted aside, impossibly agile for its bulk, vanishing into the shadows with a rustle of leaves. Sherry shouted, "Fall back!" her voice cutting through the haze, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Jessica, threw her over my shoulder, her weight light, fragile, her body trembling against mine, and ran, her ragged breaths hot against my neck, her fingers digging into my jacket like claws. The chase through hell, a predator's game, pursued us. The sound came first, heavy, uneven footfalls crashing through the underbrush. A storm given form, branches snapping like brittle bones under its weight. My legs burned, lungs clawing for air, boots slipping on slick roots and loose stones, but I didn't stop. Jessica's weight shifted with every step, her mutterings, "Teeth," it smiled, "Teeth." A frantic litany against my ear. Eddie turned to fire again, his second shot wild, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the trees. His scream followed, raw and piercing, as it tackled him. A blur of gray and claws slamming him to the earth. The sound of his body hitting the ground, the wet snap of bone, echoed in my skull, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. Sherry's rifle barked twice, precise and deafening, the reports ringing off the cliffs. Then she cried out, a sharp yelp of pain that cut through the chaos. I reached the ravine's edge, my flashlight swinging wildly, and set Jessica down against a boulder, her body slumping like a rag doll. I risked a glance back. Sherry stumbled toward me, clutching her left arm, blood seeping through her fingers, staining her sleeve dark. Her face was pale, jaw clenched, but her eyes burned with defiance. "Eddie's gone," she rasped, her voice breaking for the first time, a crack in her steel. I nodded, throat tight, unable to form words. No time to mourn. The thing was close, its ragged breathing a guttural rhythm in the dark, its presence a shadow stretching over us like a net. We climbed, hauling Jessica between us, her weight shared but awkward, her mutterings looping. It smiled, it knew, it smiled. Like a broken record stuck on repeat. The ravine's rocks were slick with moss, cold under my palms, and Sherry's wound slowed her, blood dripping onto the stone in thick, dark drops. My arms ached, my breath came in gasps, but adrenaline kept us moving, a primal fuel burning through exhaustion. At the top, I collapsed to my knees, flashlight trembling in my grip, and looked down. It stood at the ravine's base, staring up, head tilted at an unnatural angle, its pale eyes catching the beam like mirrors. Then it smiled, a grotesque, deliberate twist of its maw, lips peeling back over those jagged teeth. A grin too knowing, too human for the monster it was. My blood turned to ice, my heart hammering against my ribs, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Sherry grabbed my arm, yanking me up. "Go!" she barked, and we ran. The forest a blur of clawing branches and slick earth, thorns tearing at our clothes, roots snaring our boots. The ATVs waited at the trailhead, untouched, their metal frames glinting faintly in the moonlight, a lifeline in the dark. Sherry collapsed into one, her face ashen, blood pooling on the seat, while I secured Jessica in the other, her body limp but alive, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. As I started the engine, a sound rose from the woods. Not a roar, not a growl, but a low, guttural clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing through the trees like a signal. It was close, too close. I floored it, the tires spitting gravel, the roar of the motor drowning out the terror, drowning out that clicking. Sherry's headlights cut through the night behind me, a thin thread tying us to sanity, to survival. I didn't look back. Whatever was out there had taken Eddie, and I wouldn't let it claim us too. The aftermath and the silence, echoes of the lost. The ranger station was a chaos of lights and voices when we roared in, gravel crunching under the ATV's tires. Medics swarmed Jessica, their gloved hands gentle but firm as they lifted her onto a stretcher, whisking her to a hospital in Fayetteville. Her silence was unbroken save for the occasional shudder, her body trembling as if shaking off a nightmare that wouldn't let go. Sherry's arm was bandaged on sight, the gash deep, 6 inches long, jagged from a claw or a fall, stabilized with gauze and tape, though she'd lost blood, her skin pale against the red stains on her sleeve. She sat on a bench, staring at the floor, her usual steel dulled by exhaustion, by loss. I slumped beside her, hands shaking as I recounted the night to Hargrove, my words stumbling over the impossible. Miles's body, the creature, Eddie's scream, that smile. "Bear attack," Hargrove muttered when I finished, scribbling it into the report with a pen that scratched like a nail on bone. I didn't argue. What could I say that wouldn't sound like madness, like a plea for a padded cell? Authorities searched for Eddie the next day, combing the ravine with dogs and drones, their boots churning the dirt into mud. They found pieces. His rifle snapped in two like a child's toy, the barrel bent at an impossible angle. His boots, laces intact but splattered with blood that had dried to a crust. A shred of his jacket caught on a thorn, fluttering like a flag of surrender. No body, just fragments, as if the forest had chewed him up and spat out what it didn't want. The dogs whined, noses to the ground, but the trail went cold at the ravine's edge, the scent swallowed by rock and wind. Miles's remains were recovered, zipped into a black bag. His death ruled the same. Bear attack, case closed. Jessica's account, when she finally spoke weeks later, halting, fragmented tales of a tall thing with teeth that smiled, was dismissed as trauma, filed away with a doctor's note about shock and delusion. The photo from her phone stayed with me, though. I found it in my jacket pocket days later, tucked there by some instinct I don't recall, its edges creased from where I'd gripped it too hard. I didn't put it there. Couldn't have, not with my hands full of Jessica, of panic. But there it was, a blurry testament to the night. That maw, those pale eyes, that smile etched in pixels. I locked it in a drawer at home, the key cold against my palm, and told no one. Hargrove wouldn't believe it. Sherry wouldn't want to see it. But I can't forget it, won't forget it. The evidence unearthed, clues in the carnage. Let's sift through this, piece by piece, because the truth isn't in the sanitized report Hargrove filed. It's in what we touched, what we saw, what we can't unsee. That water bottle, scratched and smeared, wasn't dropped carelessly. It was abandoned in haste, a relic of flight. The dark stain on the cap, blood, I'd stake my life on it, though the lab never got it. Hints at violence, a struggle cut short. The campsite, stripped bare, wasn't ravaged by wind or scavengers. Something took everything, tent, packs, hope, leaving only the fire pit as a mocking footprint. The deer, hollowed out with no sign of feeding, breaks every law of nature I've studied. Bears maul for meat, cougars strip sinew, wolves gnaw bones clean. This was different, a display of power, not hunger, the torso shredded for no purpose but ruin. Those barefoot prints in the ravine, human yet not, tell a story of their own. Toes too long, unnaturally elongated, steps too erratic. They weren't Jessica's or Miles's. Not with their hiking boots accounted for. They belonged to something else, something heavy, deliberate, its chaos a mask for intent. I traced one with my finger, felt the depth. Whatever made it weighed more than a man, moved with purpose beyond reason. Miles's body, limbs torn off with surgical brutality, no claw marks, no bite wounds, screams intent, not instinct. A bear would have left gashes, dragged the corpse to a den. This was precise, personal, the stumps jagged yet bloodless, as if the life had been siphoned out. Sherry's words, caught off guard, echo in my head, a truth too stark to dodge. The photo seals it. Blurry, yes, but undeniable. That maw, gaping and toothy, those pale eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. They're no trick of light, no hallucination born of fear. Jessica saw it up close, felt its breath. We saw it from yards away, felt its gaze. The clicking sound that followed us, low and rhythmic, wasn't wind or branches. It was deliberate, a signal, a taunt. And that smile, grotesque, knowing. It wasn't animal reflex. It was a mind at play, savoring the chase. Eddie's death wasn't random. He turned, he fired, and it took him, broke him, left his gear as a marker. The rifle snapped like kindling, the boots splattered red. Bears don't do that. They don't vanish without tracks, without fur, without a trace beyond blood and ruin. Jessica's silence is evidence too. Not just shock, but the weight of something she can't name, something that smiled at her and let her live. And the pit we didn't find. Maybe it's out there still, hidden beneath those cliffs, a grave of bones, a cache of proof. The evidence points to a predator, yes, but not one we've cataloged. Not bear, not cougar, not man gone feral. Something older, sharper, hungrier. The Ozarks' hidden hunger, a land that devours. The Ozark National Forest isn't just wilderness. It's a living thing, ancient and insatiable. A sprawl of green and gray that stretches across Arkansas and Missouri like the hide of some slumbering beast. Its hills rise jagged with limestone. Its hollows cradle shadows and streams. A labyrinth of cliffs and caves that defy mapping. Whitaker Point, Hawksbill Crag to the locals, juts from its heart. A vista of beauty and dread. Its unofficial trails spidering into the dark like veins. I've walked these woods 8 years, heard the stories. Lights flickering where no paths run. Screams swallowed by the trees. Shadows that shift when you turn away. I'm not superstitious, not the type to jump at ghost tales. But the Ozarks have a weight, a presence that presses against you, whispering of things best left alone. The whispers go back decades, centuries if you dig deep. In 1872, a ranger named Silas Tate vanished near Big Bluff, 10 miles south of Whitaker. His pack was found a mile from his last checkpoint, straps intact, contents untouched, food, water, a journal with the last entry scratched out. No body, no tracks, just absence. In 1898, a hunter's camp was discovered near Devil's Den. His rifle bent double, stock splintered. A smear of blood on a pine trunk, the only sign he'd been there. No carcass, no struggle, just gone. Locals talk of the wild man. A figure half myth, half memory, tall, gaunt, seen at dusk with eyes that catch the light. Some say he's a hermit gone mad, others a spirit of the hills, but what we saw wasn't a man. It was taller, leaner, its claws and teeth a mockery of anything human, its smile a blade of intent. The Ozarks have history. Osage tribes roamed here before settlers came, leaving tales of spirits that demand tribute, of hollows where the earth hungers. The caves beneath these hills, thousands, some mapped, most not, hide bones and shadows, stalactites dripping like teeth. In 1934, a spelunker found a skull in Blanchard Springs caverns, human but cracked, surrounded by animal bones arranged in a spiral. No one claimed it, no one explained it. The forest's silence isn't peace. It's anticipation, a predator's patience. Was this creature born here, sculpted by the land's hunger? Or did it wander in, twisted by years of isolation? I don't know. But that smile, deliberate, knowing, suggests a mind, not just instinct. It wasn't hunting for survival. It was reveling in the kill, in the fear. The unofficial trails, like the one we followed, are shunned for a reason. Hikers vanish, not often, but enough that rangers keep quiet, that locals warn their kids to stick to the maps. In 2005, a couple disappeared near Petit Jean. Their tent found slashed, their camera missing its memory card. In 2011, a hunter's dog came back alone, whining, its collar stained red. The forest keeps its secrets, buries them deep, and what we saw was one of them. A thing that doesn't just kill but plays. A predator the land itself might have birthed when these hills were young. A deeper dive. Echoes of the unknown across the wilds. This isn't the Ozarks' first brush with darkness. It's a thread in a tapestry of wilderness horrors stretching across the country, each a mirror to our night. In 2009, Owen Delmare tracked a missing farmer in New York's Cattaraugus County, finding Jesse Harper, a transient who'd turned a barn into a charnel house of trophies. Teeth, fingers, scraps of clothing, a notebook of mad ravings about cleansing the land and paying the debt. He'd hunted for years, a ghost in the woods, until Owen's machete ended him. In 2003, Luke Trenton faced a clawed thing in West Virginia's Blackwater Falls. A grotesque hybrid of human and beast, its lair a cabin of bones and jars, organs floating in murky liquid. It lunged, he fired, and he dragged a survivor out, but the creature slipped away. Trent Mollery, in 2016, uncovered a pit of human remains in California's Jedediah Smith Redwoods, left by Aaron Krall, a feral hunter who laughed as he killed, his pit lined with stakes, his hands stained red. Sawyer Bell, in 2018, chased a knife-wielding hermit through Nevada's Great Basin, finding runes and bodies tied to a mining cult's bloody past. Human sacrifices to forgotten gods, etched into limestone. Victor Drayton's 2013 case in Arkansas's Ouachita National Forest turned up feral figures. A cave of blood and bones, a group preying on hikers for decades, led by an escaped convict from the 80s. Caleb Hart's 1993 encounter near Yellowstone found a chanting man and a lean-to of remains, tied to tales of forest spirits demanding sacrifice. Lily Rayburn's bones confirmed it. Eric Haldane's 2018 search in the Ouachita unearthed Abel Grisham, a drifter with pits of gnawed bones, tools, and clothing. 3 more caches found later, the Kavanaughs among them. Darren Whitlow's 2012 hunt in Minnesota's Superior National Forest ended with Elias Gruder, a cleanser who saw the woods as his altar, his pit a grave of skulls and rope-bound hands. Each story mirrors ours, wilderness as crucible, spawning horrors that defy reason. Harper, Krall, Grisham, Gruder. They were men gone savage, driven by madness or hunger, their hands human, their minds twisted. Our creature was different. Gaunt, clawed, relentless, yes, but that smile sets it apart. The prints, the photo, the deer's ruin, they point to something beyond human decay. Something not born of a broken mind but of the earth itself, a predator older than the trails we walk. The patterns are chilling. Isolation breeds monsters, but not all are flesh and blood. The Ozarks thing fits. Its form, its hunger. But its grin suggests a consciousness, a delight in the hunt that Harper's trophies or Gruder's ravings never held. Was it once a man, warped by the forest's will, a hermit turned beast over decades? Or a relic of something primal? A hunger the hills nursed when the Osage still sang to the spirits? The evidence, the print's weight, the photo's clarity, the deer's deliberate shredding, leans to the latter, but the truth is a shadow we didn't grasp, a question that lingers in the clicking dark. Could you face the maw? A challenge to your soul. Picture this. You're on that trail, alone. The sun sinking below the ridge, painting the trees in blood and gold. Your flashlight catches a torn jacket, a smear of blood on a rock, the air thickening with silence. That clicking begins, low, deliberate, circling like a predator's breath. You find the phone, see that photo, those teeth, those eyes, that smile, and feel the weight of its gaze. Would you press on, boots crunching toward the ravine, chasing answers in the dark? Or turn back, heart pounding, praying it doesn't follow, that the clicking fades? Could you stand at the cliff's edge, staring into that grin, and hold your ground? Or would your legs betray you, fleeing a terror you can't name? Tell us, what would you do if the Ozarks whispered your name, if that maw opened for you? How deep would you go before the forest claimed its due? The aftermath. Living with the echoes and the unseen. Jessica's in a hospital now, a ward in Fayetteville where the lights hum and the walls are too white. She's alive, but a ghost of herself. Her freckles stark against pale skin, her hands trembling as they clutch a blanket. She speaks in fragments. It smiled, it knew, it waited. And the doctors nod, prescribing pills for trauma, for nightmares that don't end. Her sketches, once precise maps, are now jagged lines and toothy shapes, scribbled in the margins of hospital notepads. Sherry's arm healed, the scar a jagged ribbon across her bicep, but she doesn't mention Eddie, doesn't meet my eyes when we pass in the station. His absence is a hole we don't fill, a silence louder than his laugh ever was. I'm still here, sifting through gear in the garage, replaying that night in my head. The snap of Eddie's rifle, the weight of Jessica on my shoulder, that clicking echoing through the trees. The photo sits in a locked drawer at home, its edges worn from my fingers, a secret I can't share. I don't show it to Hargrove, to Sherry, to anyone. What's the point? They'd call it a trick, a blur, a mind broken by fear. But I know what I saw, what we survived. The forest stays silent, its cliffs and caves a vault of secrets, its trails a snare for the unwary. How many more are out there, waiting for the next fool to wander too deep, to hear that clicking and see that smile? The Ozarks don't forgive. They don't forget. And neither will I.